How a vivisector, a mentee of the legendary Harry Harlow, decided to become a cruelty-free scientist. It's all about the ethics for John Gluck. Next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this behind-the-scenes look at PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. On today's episode, how a mentee of one of the most despised animal experimenters came to terms with his past and discovered his ethical identity as a scientist. John Gluck experimented on upwards of 100 rhesus macaques during his career that began at the University of Wisconsin, studying under the notorious experimenter Harry Harlow. Gluck found his way when he began to see the monkeys as patients, not as test subjects. But the ethical foundation went back to how he treated animals with kindness as a kid. That helped him see that what he was doing to the animals in the name of science was just wrong. After some time at the Kennedy Institute of Ethics at Georgetown, Gluck became a bioethicist and found a new life as a professor of psychology and senior advisor to the president on animal research, ethics, and welfare at the University of New Mexico. In 2016, he wrote a book, Voracious Science and Vulnerable Animals, a primate scientist's ethical journey, which has become a guide for young scientists who refuse to do science without ethics. Here's my conversation with bioethicist John Gluck on the PETA Podcast. After the book, and it's taken a while, it's taken some time, do you regret not doing this sooner?
I think the book followed my sense of regret. Once I think I kind of, was able to fully encounter what I felt like I had missed or not understood or not paid, proper, ethical attention to, I was very regretful. And I would say that, the main problem I had was I didn't know who to talk to about this. And when I was struggling with the questions about, how to continue my work or not, there was very few people in my life that, other than my family, that I could talk to about this. I mean, professionally, there wasn't much in the way of individuals. There was one particular individual, but there were very few people I could go to, like fellow, colleagues and so on, and say, I'm having these questions and I'd like to talk to somebody about it. And there was not very many people who were interested in hearing it.
That must have made you feel somewhat of an oddball. Did it encourage you to think, I must have made the right decision? Or did it make you say, I better put the white coat back on?
I think by the time I was, looking for, people to have a conversation with, I was pretty deep into the perspective of I knew what I was doing, and I just wasn't sure exactly how I was going to accomplish it. One thing I did do was, I had a man in my life, Brett Snyder, who was a research veterinarian at my institution, and he was the person I could talk to about it. And because early on he had questioned me about whether I knew as much about monkeys as I thought I did. And because I would ask for his help about, achieving, some sort of outcome or another. And he was very, very nice, but would say, well, these questions and these suggestions you have indicate to me you really don't know the animal very well. And of course, I wouldn't have, at that time, I would have called myself an expert laboratory primatologist. So that's really what got me thinking about, my own assumptions about myself. But when I started looking seriously to have conversations and to learn more about animal ethics in general and bioethics in general, I was pretty sure I knew what I was doing.
Well, when no one would talk to you, and when you were all there out by yourself in some ways, it must have made you feel like you're onto something that other people, hadn't evolved to this point, but you must have really felt, I mean, did you feel like I've discovered something? This must be real.
Oh yeah, I was pretty sure about that. I mean, the fact that I couldn't stir up too many conversations didn't dissuade me.
I go to one page in your book where you say the crux of the story is that you slowly became conscious of the animal's point of view.
Yeah, right.
And you recognize that what you were doing as a scientist didn't square with your own moral standards.
Right.
That's a real schism that I guess, do most scientists live with that schism, or do they transform like you did?
I think obviously science is a powerful dynamic in our society and in our lives in general. But I think that, there are, limitations. And one of those limitations, I think, is the emphasis that's there to quite an extent of depending on traditional approaches to doing your work. Now, I was very interested in neurodegenerative disorders and things of that sort, and that was from primarily observing them in my own family, people suffering and not getting much in the way of relief. But I think what happens, at least I can say for sure, in the animal research world, doing animal research first, if you're trying to understand a particular kind of issue or problem or human disease, is so naturalized. I mean, it's been going on since the 18th century. That's how we think about, well, what do we do now? What's the first thing we do? Well, you start with, dissecting an animal, or you start, exposing an animal to this experience or that experience, and so on. And it's what some people have called a thought style that gets developed. There was a microbiologist back in the 1930s, a man named Ludwig Fleck, who wrote about this, and he talked about thought styles and the solidarity that gets created around members of a collective.
Hey, John, are you talking about science? Or are you talking about a cult?
Well, I think what Fleck was talking about was what were the things that we had to be very much aware of in order to have a solid and valid science. But he also recognized, and others, of course, have recognized it as well, that doing science is also a social activity, and some of the dynamics that control and influence social dynamics in non-scientific settings also find their way into understanding about how we're going to operate in a particular scientific lab. And so I wouldn't use the word cult, but I would use the word collective. That there's that you develop a sense of confidence in what you're being taught about how to proceed with your work.
And so everyone should look at their org chart to see how this confidence collective thing comes up and how thought styles have a role here. And so what was the scientific thought style that you were you trapped in it? Is that how you view it now?
Well, the thought style that I found most uncomfortable was just what I was saying. You couldn't get people to talk about the ethics of the work. And let me give you an example of that. I was invited by a member of the medical school faculty to debate him about whether nature or nurture was most important in the development of intelligence. And he called me up because I had been doing work looking at non-human primates who had been raised with limited social experience and comparing them to animals raised in fairly normal situations. And I was comparing them on the basis of how they could solve complex discrimination problems. So he saw me as a person who was an individual who was emphasizing that experience influenced intelligence, and he was taking the side that predominantly intelligence was a purely genetic thing. So anyhow, we had this
debate.
No, it was a debate. It was a very pleasant kind of setting in front of about 150 medical students, and he was talking about the work, that was these twin studies that had been going on for about 80 some odd years, comparing the intelligence scores of twins raised together and raised apart and things of that sort. And of course, the evidence there was that there was a very strong connection between twins who, even though they didn't have the same environment, they tended to demonstrate similar kind of intellectual IQ performance. And I gave some study. I talked about some of my own research where we were feeling that we could manipulate intelligence in non-human primates by either lowering or increasing the complexity of the environments in which they live. And but then, it occurred to me that there had been a book written very recently before this particular debate, and it was written by a Princeton psychologist who had studied a lot of the methodology and papers of this psychologist Cyril Burt, who was like one of the first people to really do these twin studies and make the argument that environment has very little to do with development of intelligence. But anyhow, the importance of this particular book was this psychologist had determined that the Cyril Burt had made up his data, or had to a great extent had made it up,
falsified. He falsified.
He falsified it, right? And so I bring this up in my part of the debate, and I said, well, there is this research that some of the fundamental studies may have been fraudulently produced. The conversation stops, and students leave, and I go up to this fellow and I said, "Thank you for inviting me," and so on. And he's looking at me like it was the most hostile look I'd seen on a person's face since being a teenager. And it was like, well, what's the problem? And I stuck my hand out to shake his hand. He says, well, and he wouldn't shake my hand. And he said, well, the thing is, I will never invite you again to have this discussion. And I said, well, why's that? And he said, well, you let the cat out of the bag. I said, well, what's that? What do you mean? That he said, well, you confused these students by bringing up the possibility of there being some ethically significant fraudulent activity going on in that particular research laboratory. And I said, well, how is that isn't that something they should know? But he was like, you confused the students. They needed to hear, an absolutely straight down the line, this is what the truth is, and so on and so forth.
You were the authoritarian in the white coat, although on the other side of this doctor, you're the authoritarian in front of these medical students. And to the other doctor you were debating, you were the white coat brotherhood. You broke the white coat brotherhood principle, I guess, huh?
Well, I guess so, but I didn't know I had such a thing.
Yeah.
I didn't know there was such a thing. I mean, I was aware that there is an ethical framework around science, but what he was telling me was, look, we don't talk about those things. And I was so shocked by that it was like, well, it just seemed absolutely absurd to me. I mean, and I began to reflect a little bit more seriously about how little I was thinking about ethics in the context of my work and in the context of my interactions with non-human animals. And it was like, my idea for a study was I just needed to have it.
Yeah.
And if I had a good idea, we just did it.
And compare yourself and your reaction with the other scientists. Were the other scientists that you knew, were they acting just like this other fellow, like, we're just doing it and we're part of this thought style? Is that sort of the way things, I mean, that was the status quo, that was the tradition, right?
Well, I think so. I mean, and I would say that, it wasn't like, for example, you'd hear, evidence of somebody's lab perhaps mistreating animals or doing, improper surgeries or things of that sort. But it wasn't something that was discussed openly.
Was this the first time that it hit you? I mean, you said you were shocked, but was this the first opening that said, oh, this is an area of inquiry that most of my fellow scientists aren't going down? I got to go down in there and see.
Well, yes, I think that's what that really, broke through the resistance of, just sticking with tradition and the ways I was taught to do research and how I was taught to come up with problems and develop methodology. So I think that was an extremely important moment, and it was pretty early in my academic life.
So,
and
but it wasn't enough to get you off track. Describe the moment, John, where it went from, here is a scientist who falsified the evidence for this twin study. When did it get to, here I am with a live monkey trying to get a study. I've got hundreds of thousands of dollars for me and the university. We've got to do it, but there's something wrong here. When did that moment happen?
I mentioned earlier my interactions with the animal lab vet, Brett Snyder.
Right.
And I mean, and let me put it this way. This particular veterinarian, and I've worked with, quite a few others over the years I was in graduate school and so on. And most of the time, the vets in the labs were expected to help you get the research done. If an animal was losing too much weight, you would go to the vet and say, well, the animal's losing too much weight and we need to get the weight up so we could continue this drug study or whatever it happened to be. And that's pretty much what most of the people I saw as researchers, what they expected from veterinarians. Well, the difference with this particular lab animal vet was he wanted me to encounter the animals as they were patients, not just subjects. That they were patients, dealing with the stresses and strains of what I was imposing on them, and they weren't just experimental subjects. So he was asking me or encouraging me to try to close the distance between me and the animal. So I would be able to pay more attention to what I was doing and how it was actually affecting them with respect to pain and distress and things of that sort. So I think that his encouragement to, in fact, just know more about the animal you're working with.
You weren't looking at them as living beings before?
Oh, of course, you look at them as as living beings, but I think the emphasis is that you think of them, or I was thinking of them as beings that fit a particular experimental design. And what was important was the outcome of their response to the experimental procedures, but not necessarily encountering them as individuals and getting to know them as individuals and getting to know more about how animals express distress or showed fear. You have to be able to close the distance between you and the animal to be able to start paying adequate attention to those kinds of dynamics.
When Brett Snyder called your attention to this, how did that change your world?
Well, it took me back to the way I thought about animals when I was growing up. And in my home, in my family, animals certainly were family members, and they were given high priority about what food they had, and when they went to the vet, there was a great deal of sensitivity to them. But I found early on in my academic life that having that kind of sensitivity didn't participate well in some of the work that I was being asked to do with animals. Like raising them in particular difficult situations, or exposing them to distressful situations, or keeping food from them so they would perform more adequately in an experiment, and so on. So it became a clash between, what do I do here? I want to be a scientist. I want to study these particular issues that I'm really fascinated by. I was going to have to put that kind of family connectedness with the animals aside. Otherwise, I wasn't going to make any progress.
You have these feelings as a kid, and now you're an adult and you're embarking on this career. How do you rationalize this conflict that you're experiencing?
I think making the transition from being have my primary relationship with animals being that of domesticated members of the family, to sources of information in an experimental context. It caused me to ask, or assume really, that the work we were doing justified the harms produced. And it seemed like most people agreed with that notion, that the benefits of the research process were adequate to justify the difficult lives that many of the animals had to live.
And so once again, the community, the collective, the thought style kept you going. When did it get to be too much? Was there a particular animal, a particular experiment that made you say, wait a minute here, there's an ethical concern?
Well, I think the experience of being encouraged by the veterinarians to close the distance between me and the animals, so that I was paying more and closer attention to them as beings that were capable of suffering. I think that made an extraordinary difference, and I started, I think, doing that, closing the distance between myself and the animals. And I had it wasn't like one incident that changed me. It was just a lot of discoveries over a fairly long period of time.
Well, describe the key one that said, this is I would imagine that the distance was further than you thought, between when you were trying to close the gap?
Yeah. Oh, no, I think that's right. I think that, there was, I know in my book, I wrote about an interaction I had with a female rhesus monkey numbered G49. And I was asked to come up and look at a monkey that was limping. While I was up in the lab, I was watching this monkey G49 behaving in a way that I just couldn't quite understand what she was doing. So I spent a lot of time paying attention to her. And she was living in an individual cage, and I would see her. Sometimes she would sit at the back of the cage, and then she would run up toward one of the walls, which was a solid wall made of stainless steel, and she would press her face against it, and then she would sit back down and make all these facial expressions and things of that sort, and then she would go up on this wall again. And what I realized eventually, what she was doing was there was a bolt missing in that solid wall. And what she was doing was using that bolt hole to see other monkeys in the room. And then going back and like she was trying to direct social signals through that little hole toward other monkeys. And then she would jump up there again to see if they'd reacted to it or if they had been able to see it. And it was such a, it was like just one of these moments. It was, just how devastatingly extreme the limitations that this very complex, intelligent being was living in. And she was living in that situation because I put her there.
And when did that limitation equate to cruelty and to something that crossed the ethical line?
Well, I thought, I in that particular, moment of experience with G49, it was what I was doing worth the kind of unbelievably limiting constraints I had placed on her life? And instead of just automatically thinking, well, this is research and we're going to find something important, or maybe we will, I questioned it. I said became very unsure that the benefits of my experimental work, at least in the area I was in, was making any sense given what I was demanding of the animals in terms of limiting their lives.
And did you ever name G49?
Oh yeah. Yeah. She was Moose. And she had a name, but we tended to use the numbers as, to keep that distance.
And when you cut that distance, her name was, did you say Loose?
Moose.
Moose.
Okay.
like a moose.
Yeah,
All right,
yeah, like a moose.
So I thought you said loose like Lucy, but she was moose like Moosey. And so when you started seeing moose as moose and you cut the distance, how did that impact your scientific work, and how did it cut the distance between you and science?
Well, it made it clearer and clearer to me that this was a violation of my own moral preferences, and that I couldn't, if I was being honest, I couldn't be so confident that the benefits coming from the work were worth the limitations I was placing on these beings.
If you weren't honest with yourself, could it bring into question the credibility of the honesty or the truth that you're trying to find through science?
No, I wouldn't say that. I would say, that, trying to understand, like I thought I was, primarily trying to do, was the understanding how the environment influences brain development and supports activities like learning and so on. I think those were good questions, but I became clear that the way I was pursuing those questions was ethically improper, and that it called for other ways of doing this.
So,
Not changing the questions necessarily,
right.
but finding other ways to chase down this information in a less damaging way.
So you looked for alternatives, but given sets of scientists who'd say, "Oh, well, he's abandoning that. We'll just continue on the traditional way. We'll get to the answer quicker." Was there that kind of competitiveness that you found amongst other scientists in the lab or competing labs?
When I was making this turn, how other scientists and colleagues were conducting their professional activities became less of a competitive comparison. It was. I think the question of how I could be a scientist with an ethical identity became the prominent and primary focus of what I was trying to accomplish.
So, in other words, it was still pretty much you and how you can deal with this clash. But as far as other scientists go, well, how did you? I mean, there's a gap there too between you and the other scientists. If you're going in these alternative directions, how did you deal with that gap with the people who would insist? Well, of course you could do that to moose. Of course you could do that to G49.
Yeah.
And it had to eat at you because you had these values. How did you reconcile those things with amongst the other people in the collective?
When academia works well, changing positions or changing theories or changing approaches to the study is usually accepted. And I think, I was a tenured professor at this particular time, so I had a job that I couldn't be fired from, and of course that was traditionally why the tenure system developed, just so that people can change direction or go left instead of going right, as they had been in terms of their intellectual work. So I would say that, I think people were unhappy with me when I decided that I needed to close the lab and I got more involved in bioethics at a professional level. I think people were annoyed, and I think I probably didn't get as good a raise as I might have on some of those initial years. But there was never a question that you have to stop changing. It was the expectation you would.
But John, what you're suggesting though is such a radical departure. I mean, you just mentioned how much you were, in a way punished by not getting certain raises, but you had to see this as a real, not just a turn, but a real 180 in a way, as you searched for alternatives and started to look at animals as real beings that felt pain, and that the things that were happening in that lab were essentially cruel and horrific things in some experiments, right?
No doubt about it. From the perspective of the animal, there's no question that what you say is correct.
I mean, you're describing some real not nice things that your colleagues are doing to you, like practically disowning you. And you were doing a total 180 from science. So that had to impact you somewhat, or a lot more than you're letting on, no?
Well, see, now I would put it a different way. What the path I was developing was not away from science, but away toward ethical science. And my plan was to begin teaching more in the ethics realm of research, both human and animal. That was the decision I'd make. How could I contribute? I could contribute as a teacher, as a professor, teaching students who were, taking on a scientific profession, the importance of ethical discovery. And so that was how I saw myself. I didn't see I was leaving science, but I was developing a proficiency in the ethical frameworks that should embrace science.
And, you write in your book that, hey, this isn't a matter of being narcissistic or self-aggrandizing or a matter of presenting yourself as a model of virtue. But were there some people, some colleagues who did think that?
That I was a model of virtue?
When you're going this ethical route. Yeah. Oh, there's John trying to be ethical on us. John, put on the white coat and do the work. Come on. You're talking to your lab buddies here. Yeah.
I'm not saying people didn't think that. But I didn't experience it directly, but I could tell you this, the way I did experience it directly. I had a sabbatical leave coming up, which was a year off to do other study. So I I looked around where I could go study research ethics during this sabbatical leave, and I discovered this program at Georgetown University at the Kennedy Institute of Ethics. And I applied to the Kennedy Institute of Ethics to their visiting fellows program, and they were precisely interested in people who were interested in ethics in research, ethics in clinical care, things of that sort. So I applied. I got accepted. I submitted my application to take the sabbatical and go to Georgetown, and it was turned down. And I went to the dean. I said, "How is this possible? Here I am, applying to this perfectly credible program to learn about research ethics." And he said, "Well, the committee doesn't think that's going to benefit your career." And I said, "Well, now there it is, that developing an expertise in ethics of research is a waste of time." I mean, that came through loud and clear. And so I said to the dean, I said, I want you to talk the committee out of this, because I know exactly what I'm doing. And if they don't, you and I will have to part ways. I'll have to go get a job somewhere else. And he bought it. He understood what I was saying, and he made it possible for me to go to Georgetown University and the Kennedy Institute of Ethics.
Wow. Well, that was a person who looked at the science, or looked at it from the subjective point of view. But you can see where a lot of people would see that, hey, you're showing us up, buddy. You're making us making us look bad, but just like the other guy, who debated you, who said, you're breaking the brotherhood. Now, that's, and coming from you, John, if I can call you John, Dr. Gluck, coming from you, you were an acolyte of Harry Harlow, essentially, right? I mean, he was. Am I placing you too high on the totem pole, or I mean, you were really following in his footsteps?
My graduate work was done at the University of Wisconsin and at the primate laboratory at the University of Wisconsin, and Harry Harlow was the director. And he was one of my active mentors during graduate school. I had three really solid individuals who were involved in my education, and Harry Harlow was definitely one of them. I knew him very well.
Did any of these ideas that you had come up when you were studying with Harlow and talking with him? Did you say, God, I wouldn't do this to my cat at home. Why am I doing it to these monkeys?
Yeah. Well, I think this is it's an interesting problem. I mean, when I was at the University of Wisconsin, and Harlow was involved and deeply involved in my work, he was already a world famous scientist. The problem with being a world famous scientist is, and I discovered this, that people don't challenge you. And I think he was in a world where he was well known for his work on neuroplasticity. He was well known on his work on the intelligence and social capabilities of non-human primates. And then I think he started to get much more, he lost kind of contact with what is a decent way to do science. And frankly, I don't think any of us, and I would say that about myself for sure, never challenged him about it. It was like he was in charge, and if he modeled a way of doing research that was seen as acceptable and then gained him all sorts of prizes and awards, that was the model that we were going to follow.
Some of those feelings of back home and how you dealt with animals had to have come up during that time, right?
Sure.
And
yeah, absolutely.
You squelched them pretty much?
Well, I would say yes, of course. That's exactly what happened.
And now that you see Harry Harlow for what he is, I bet you challenge him now. I mean, he's gone, but I bet you challenge him now, right?
Well, I think a lot about Harry Harlow, and I mean, and not just the some of the very painful studies that he did. But he was a very supportive mentor, and I think I didn't take advantage of him. I didn't challenge him, even when I was saying, well, gee, I think this is going too far in terms of an experimental setup. And the question you might ask is, how would he have experienced those challenges? My sense is he would have listened, because he was ahead of the pack when it came to understanding the intelligence of non-human primates and the social dynamics of their development and so on. He was way ahead, but he didn't see the ethical implications of those findings. And I think we, or some his colleagues, failed him too.
You say he would have listened, but how about this question? Were there ethical alternatives back then that he could have embraced and should have embraced?
I think the alternative, of course, was doing what you could with humans, and the idea of, like, say, studying orphans or individuals who have been raised in homes where they suffered abuse and things of that sort. I mean, that was a direction that could have been taken. That would have been more direct in trying to understand, how development can go wrong during the socialization process. And but it was like, he was a primatologist. And, that's another one of those limitations that we've been talking about, is you start thinking of yourself as a particular kind of person, and this is the kind of work that you do, not this work, not the alternative work, not the other way of thinking about it. So, I mean, I think he was stuck there too. But I should also say he got a great deal of support that felt that he was doing what needed to be done in experimental ways, even if it was being done with painful outcomes and with non-human primates.
John, you broke up a little bit. He got support from the university. What were you saying? He got great support from?
He brought in millions of dollars worth of money to the university. was a highly sought after lecturer, and when people invite you to give a lecture, they usually want you to give it on what's made you famous.
Yeah.
And,
John, you write in your book, you say that to avoid ethical reflection requires an extraordinary level of self-deception, rationalization, and selective blindness. Have you thought about that? I guess it's kind of like a cloud that hovers over you.
Yeah.
Where are you now in terms of all of that? Have you now see clearly, or how would you where would you put yourself now?
Where would I put myself now? I can understand what I was involved in and what some of my colleagues were involved in, but I can't justify it. And I think that quote you just read, I think I believe that to be precisely true. That it takes a good deal of not paying attention to reality to carry on some of that work. And there's no doubt about that.
There was an idea in the book. You called yourself a monkey life thief. Explain that.
Well, I mean, that's how I began to see what I'd done. Was it's just another way of saying that I was what I was doing was not ethically justified. That I was apprehending lives and getting them to dance to my tune. And I didn't think the tune was worth humming after a while.
And is there any sense of like how many monkeys you were, that you dealt with? Did you ever quantify it and think about that?
Oh, sure. I mean, after a while, the Animal Welfare Act required you to submit records on how many animals that you were using, how many, what species, were they animals that were being used in experiments that were painful or not. So, I mean, that process required by the Animal Welfare Act, I think was part of it. You start to see the numbers of what this work is requiring, and what would I say? I think I interacted with probably personally responsible for certainly over 100 non-human primates.
And do you think about the things that you made them do, or that you put them through? Besides, like moose, G95, is there one thing that comes to mind that when you're more reflective and thinking about those days when you were in the labs, that it just reminds you that you're doing the right thing now?
That was why I wrote the book, because my sense was it wasn't enough to regret just in private. It was more important for me to regret and explain that regret more openly in a public forum, and hopefully influencing some of my colleagues, and so that they would understand what motivated my changes and why I thought it was important to have that discussion and to extend the extent of the ethics education in science. That was why I wrote that book. Anybody who's written a book knows, it takes a lot of your life to do it.
Yeah.
And I was happy to provide it.
The book, Voracious Science and Vulnerable Animals, A Primate Scientist's Ethical Journey. It's by University of Chicago Press, and it's been out a few years, but it's kind of a building block in a way in terms of, changing the direction of where science is going. Tell me how your book, your exploration in making science more ethical, how can that change the future of young scientists? How can it change the direction so that we go away from vivisection? There's that term. How do we go away from that?
Yeah. The kind of thought process that has to be involved here is to work at not limiting the emotional expression that you experience as a scientist. There's a lot of work and a lot of encouragement to narrow the emotional realm that emerges during research. Make it more narrow. Don't pay attention to, even to some of your questions. Carry on. Continue. Finish the experiments. Analyze those experiments. And, think in terms of those kinds of things as opposed to what am I doing? How is this work actually affecting my life? I've met, many scientists over the years who have talked to me about how their work changed their lives and how they felt like they had to make up for it. So by trying to encourage that these kinds of topics become not hidden things that are whispered, at times when you're just having some social event, that you're actually taking on those kinds of questions in the flow of the science you're doing. And I think what we're seeing now, of course, and I would say now meaning at least the last 10 years, is that the validity of a lot of the animal models that we used is being questioned. And the question being, do they in fact provide adequate insight into the human condition? And I think the findings have been pretty disappointing, I think, to a lot of people in that continue to do that research. So, but, does it make sense to not pay attention to that literature? No. What it requires you is to know it very well. And from the perspective of recognizing that your work also insults and hurts lots of other human beings, shouldn't that encourage us to seek alternatives in and of itself? So I think as scientists, we have to be connected to the world we live in.
So it's really a matter of asking more questions. Don't narrow. Include more questions. You might find the better answer, I guess. Exactly.
There was an incident that occurred in graduate school that has stayed in my mind for all this 50 some odd years. And it was, I was at a meeting and we were all discussing the research that had demonstrated that the chimpanzee Washoe had learned American Sign Language. And we were having this discussion, and it was all a very heady discussion about, is American Sign Language a language, and all these various types of linguistic analysis of the data. And one fellow who was in this group raises his hand and says, "I have a question. Well, what would you do, or what would you have to do if this chimpanzee Washoe, using American Sign Language, signals out, 'Let me out of here. I don't want to do this anymore'?" Well, what would your question be? What would your responsibility be? And I mean, he was raising an ethical question, and frankly, we didn't recognize it as such. But it was the great question. It was a great question. And those are the kinds of questions we have to be asking ourselves as scientists. And
Well, John, one of the other questions is the question of relevance, and whether or not any of these studies are applicable or relevant to really a direct, making a direct hit on the human experience, or to answer any of the human issues that are out there that you're trying to find answers to. And generally speaking, it's not relevant, these animal studies, right?
Well, I think what's becoming clear that depending on the animal models to give us direct answers to how to intervene in human disease is becoming more and more clear. It's becoming more and more clear that they're not as effective at doing that as we once hoped they would be.
So,
and it's just the crying out for alternatives.
So what do you tell the young scientists? And I know that one of the things that PETA has done in the last 10, 15 years is it's grown its number of ethical scientists who are looking for alternatives and looking for ways to end vivisection. What do you tell the younger ones who are stuck in that we're not challenging Harry Harlow enough, we're not going to dare challenge our community of scientists? How do you tell them to, or what do you say to them that would get them to make a breakthrough for themselves?
Well, I think one of the major problems that students face in the animal research world is that when you first get started in a laboratory that uses animals for biomedical or behavioral research, you have to recognize you know enough to be overly trustworthy about what your mentors are telling you to do. I mean, when you first get into the laboratory situation or you start taking laboratory courses and so on, you're in a position you're being told how to do certain kinds of research, how to think about it, and where the animal fits into all of this, and so on and so forth. But you have to recognize you don't know enough yet to be critical of those suggestions you're getting or directions you're getting from your mentors. So it's like you don't turn your life over to your mentor. Like, she's got the whole thing all settled, and what she's telling me to do or what he's telling me to do makes total sense. That's just not the way we operate as thoughtful, ethical, and creative scientists. I mean, that's the kind of thing I try to tell people. Open your mouth. Be critical. Ask naive questions. They have a place. Don't be quiet, and be civil, of course. But you've got to be verbal and allow your curiosity and your questions and your even very difficult questions about ethical relevance to be expressed.
And really, that's pretty good advice, not just for scientists, but for journalists and activists and citizens and people who are in public life, or people who are dealing with public issues, or just regular people, period.
Right. That's right. Yeah, I mean, it's, I try to tell students in science, especially in the psychology and neuroscience areas, your job is to get smart and to know a lot about the brain and so on and so forth. But your job is also to develop an ethical identity. And you can't leave that behind.
And you got to get rid of that self-deception, I guess, that you mentioned.
Oh, yeah. Oh, exactly. Exactly. I mean, that's one of the main problems of living life in general, is trying to not deceive yourself.
So it is an evolution, being a scientist. It is an evolution, this ethical journey. And how happy are you now? How comfortable are you now with yourself after having written the book and after after stopping doing what you did to those animals?
Well, I'm very pleased about having made the change from being an animal scientist to a bioethicist that is concerned with the ethical justification of animal and human research. I mean, I think this is where I've wanted to be for much longer than I recognized. And I came from a family that they weren't overly religious people, but they were very ethical people. They thought a lot about what was the right move and what was the wrong move. That was a topic of conversation that was pretty common. And we didn't discuss Plato, but we discussed, living with integrity. And so in that domain, I feel, that I'm proud of. In general, I mean, I don't think I ever escaped the faces of and frankly, I guess I'm glad I haven't forgotten them. I want to be reminded about how inconsiderate I could become as a human being, and so devoted to my own success, and losing touch with the rest of the world around me, the animals.
John, you broke up a little bit when I was asking you, when you mentioned faces. You said in general you don't ever escape the faces. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think very few days go by where either in reflection, reading about somebody else's work, or just being in that reverie of being calm, when I begin to see the cages and the animals and their predicament, and seeing their faces as individuals, seeking for justice and decent care, and that I missed a lot of those opportunities.
So those faces you don't forget.
Exactly, you don't forget.
Well, John, the good part of me says we should end it there, but the bad part of me says I must ask you a question about where we are in science right now, because we're in a kind of a funny place because of the coronavirus and public belief, public trust in science, the way our leadership. It's somewhat of a different, question, but it's related, because it's all related to how the public perceives science, right, and how we perceive the guys in the white coats. And we should challenge them, but tell me, what are some of your thoughts, given the specific time that we find ourselves in now in our relationship with science?
Well, I think the pandemic that we're experiencing around the world, and certainly in the United States, I mean, what it illustrates, I think, is how complex learning is in the scientific world. It's not like you conduct one or two comparisons and you've got the picture of what one needs to do. It's, like I was talking to a person the other day, and they were saying, well, why don't we just protect the vulnerable people who are vulnerable to COVID-19, and let the rest of us go back to work? And I said, well, do you know who all the vulnerable people are? I said, it'll take enormous amount of research to discover all the vulnerabilities. It's not an answer that comes quickly. And the importance of communication and the importance of the public understanding how science actually operates I think we get to see that understanding is not very good when you hear people just getting tired of being exposed to the important recommendations about public health measures. And the other thing that the pandemic tells us about is just that, public health. I mean, public health is an undervalued dimension of our medical and scientific world. It's more like, you get famous in science when you cure a disease. The person who finds the key to the cure for lung cancer will be a very famous person with many trophies on their wall. But a person who is working to modify the way we live in this world to benefit our health and how we can change our environments and our diets and things of that sort. We have to spend much more time in public health and not just finding the answers and cures to specific diseases.
Well, John Gluck, I really appreciate your time. I've enjoyed our conversation, and I'm glad the dog barked there in approval.
Yeah, well, I've enjoyed it too, Emil. Thank you very much.
Well,
I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, and even though you called me Emil, I say Emil, but you're the first one.
Emil, okay.
I'm going to let you say Emil because that's good. Because it's an authentic Emil coming from you.
Well,
so, but I hope that we can talk again because this is an ongoing thing. Your message to young scientists, your message to people who are, who have to deal with science, your message to the elders in science. It's important that they all consider the ethical questions. So, John, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Emil. And don't lose my phone number.
Thank you, John, and thank you for your patience on all this damn technology.
Well, we got through it.
Bioethicist John Gluck, Professor Emeritus in Psychology and Senior Advisor to the President on Animal Research, Ethics, and Welfare at the University of New Mexico. Find out more about how PETA is making science more ethical as it works to end cruel and hideous vivisection practices. For more, go to PETA.org. And that's our show for this time out. Contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok. That's EMILAMOK, or on AMOK.com. Or see my work at ALDEF, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. That's AALDEF.org/blog. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on your favorite podcast app or on Apple Podcasts, where you can rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. And don't forget, you can help the animals and PETA, especially if you have Amazon's Alexa. Just say, Alexa, donate to PETA. Our music is provided by Carbon Works. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.